Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program.
This month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives provides fresh information and insights into prison sentences. Besides discussing several problems about prison sentences, we'll also discuss some solutions that deserve more public awareness, support, and implementation. Even if you're already well informed about prison sentences, you'll learn a lot more from our expert guest. And if you're not already well informed, you'll learn a lot more than that. So that's good. I'm happy to welcome one person who will help us explore the topic. Alexandra Bailey works for a very smart nonprofit organization called the Sentencing Project. Alexandra works as senior campaign strategist for the Sentencing Project. She's an expert on the facts about unfair prison sentencing and a savvy advocate for how to solve the problems. So that's what we like to do, is we'll talk about problems on this program. On every program we do, we talk about problems, and we also pivot towards solutions. So people will notice us pivoting several times during this hour. Before joining the Sentencing Project, Alexandra Bailey was a campaign strategist and national organizing specialist for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and she's worked also for a variety of other social justice goals. So welcome, Alexandra. I'm glad that you're here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, and the viewers will have a good time, and I know that you and I will too. So let's start by summarizing the problem. I want to share some information before we get into Alexandra's substantive expertise. Just some basic facts. Too many people are sentenced to prison in the United States, and many sentences are too long. I'll share some facts and show two graphs, and then I'll ask Alexandra to share some basic information. And then after that, we'll explore some specific problems. So for a long time, you'll see on the graph's left edge from the 1920s on into the late 70s, prison populations, state and federal prison populations were pretty stable, but a huge surge began in the late 1970s. And a few years ago, the total numbers of people in jails and state and federal prisons reached about 2 million, which was the largest number of any nation on earth, even nations that have bigger populations than the US. Nearly everybody in local jails stays there for less than a year, but the graph shows how many people were in state and federal prisons from 1925 to 1979, or to 2019. I want to bring up the other graph that we'll show today here. The United States really is an outlier. You can see in the top row, United States, these are rates of incarceration per 100,000 population. So the United States was far out ahead. El Salvador had recently elected an extreme right-wing government that had a mania for going after what they thought of as drugs and gangs and stuff. So they were throwing lots and lots and lots of people in jail. And then you had Rwanda, Brazil, Russia. The United States was imprisoning twice as many people per capita as Russia. Okay. And on and on and on. And we do about 6 times as many as Canada, which is a near neighbor that we have a lot in common with, but not.
Which actually, even more interestingly, Glenn, we don't even extradite their citizens when they commit a crime in the United States because Canada cannot act out a comparable sentence to what the United States does because Canada doesn't have life without the possibility of parole.
Oh, really? Well, I always knew that Canada was more civilized than we are, and here's another data point for that. Some European nations have much lower rates than the US. Um, in a lot of European countries, if you have a drug habit, they treat that as a public health problem, and they'll use public health methods. In the United States, we say, "Hey, you're committing a crime. We're going to lock you up and put you in prison for a lot of years." And in recent years, the U.S. was imprisoning, as I showed on the graph, about twice the rate that Russia was. And I want to just mention another pitch here about the tough on crime mania that we had in recent decades since the late 1970s. And then I promise Alexandra will get a chance to talk. I just want to get this basic groundwork out of the way here so we can hear from the person who really knows what she's talking about. Since the late 1970s, politicians have passed many laws to show voters that they are tough on crime. And those tough on crime laws actually made the problems worse, as the graphs show. And so, Alexandra, let me ask you, what kinds of laws and policy changes were enacted, and what kinds of problems have those laws and policy changes caused?
Well, again, thank you so much for inviting me. My name's Alexandra Bailey. I'm the senior campaign strategist at the Sentencing Project, and the running joke in the office is that I'm not the brains, I'm the muscle. Uh, so I read papers written by our very smart PhDs, but my job is to make sure that laws get passed at the state legislative level that deal with mass incarceration. So I'm going to break up my answer to your question to the federal and the state level. So, the federal government decides that crime in America is out of control, and that actually this is going to be a very good road to the presidency and the control of both the House and the Senate at the federal level. And so there is a massive scare campaign that goes on. Maybe you remember some of the advertisements that were on TV, Just Say No, Super Predator. This was a big campaign. And Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan very much got behind it at the time. And there's a lot of backstory to their getting behind this. It's very interesting that maybe we'll get into. But we made a lot of decisions during this time. We instituted things like mandatory minimums. So if you commit offense, judges that used to have discretion don't have discretion anymore. If you are guilty of the offense, there's no mitigating factors. You're going to prison, and you're going to prison for X number of years to Y number of years. And we call that a sentencing range. They decide that drugs are going to go into a felony classification system. So, up until the late 1970s, early 1980s, the federal government was not really concerned with crack. And crack is just a form of cocaine that has been broken down to its more basic structure. So, the federal government decides that crack is sort of the number one enemy. Up until then, they
It's also used by is also thought to be used largely by African Americans. So that's an excuse to target people that we want to throw in prison anyway.
precisely. So cocaine use had been increasing,
Uh-huh.
and then the the less expensive version of this, crack, hits poorer communities. Um, Communities that are having massive economic downturn because there's been massive white flight from major urban centers to the suburbs, and that meant that the tax base and, of course, the job availability had gone down. We saw massive depression amongst communities, and then crack comes in.
Uh-huh.
Rather than treating this as a public health crisis, as other nations do, or as at least we're giving mouth service to doing now during the opioid epidemic, they decided that they can arrest their way out of this problem. So if you are found to have even a nominal amount of drugs on you, that comes with a mandatory minimum. If you're found to have it more than once, then that goes into an even more extreme mandatory minimum. And if you're found a third time, then you're done. And you might have heard that three strikes you're out law.
Yeah.
We institute no tolerance policies at schools and other places, and our prison population at the federal level continues to skyrocket, and states decide they're going to take the federal government's lead. So, for example, in New York State, Governor Rockefeller instituted what is to this day something that we're dealing with, known as the Rockefeller drug laws.
Yeah.
And almost a large swath of mandatory minimums in New York State, for which New York State has a lot, that were responsible for a massive drive in their prison population around drugs, come from that era and that governor. And you saw that trend all across the United States.
Right. Yeah.
They had a bad idea, and everybody else went, I want to do that bad idea.
I want to follow up on your reference to the three strikes thing. um, uh, these three strikes laws are a particularly stupid and particularly cruel example. In fact, I did a TV program on that a number of years ago. The U.S. has some laws targeting habitual offenders,
Ah,
right? And some of those laws require a person who's convicted of an offense after having been convicted of two previous serious crimes to mandatory life in prison. And Washington State, where I live, is generally pretty sensible, but the voters stupidly passed the US's truly first three strikes law, Initiative 593 in 1993. And sometimes these laws are called three strikes and you're out. And people might think, oh, that makes perfect sense. That's a baseball rule, right? Now, uh, people might think that's intuitively sensible because it's a baseball rule, but we should not be basing our criminal justice system based on baseball rules. The next logical step would be to pass the safe at home law, that you can commit a crime, and if you can get home and lock your door behind you, you're safe at home and the police can't ever arrest you for that offense. Do we want a safe at home law? I mean,
I don't know if that's our solution, Glenn, but it's a thought.
but I mean, if you want to pass laws about criminal justice system based on baseball rules, I mean, this shows where the craziness would go. And
Right, the natural conclusion of a lot of the things that we do is ridiculous, and I think a lot of Americans want to take their system seriously, and so they have a very hard time sort of seeing the ridiculousness,
yeah,
and the arbitrariness of why, and the lack of factual basis behind a lot of these policies.
yeah, and it's not just arbitrary in a sense of randomness. It's arbitrary in that some kinds of people get targeted for worse treatment, and we'll cover that a bit later in the interview. I don't want to get into that yet now, but let's talk about this life without parole thing. And research by your organization, the Sentencing Project, shows that violent crime peaked in about 1991, but life sentences kept escalating until 2016. So there's something is weird going on there. And the problem of life sentences is even worse with the increase in sentences of life without parole. And that means that even if a prisoner has decades of good behavior, the prisoner can never earn parole and be released. And Alexandra, I wonder, could you build upon your critique of excessively long prison sentences by sharing information about the extent to which life without parole sentences are occurring and what the problems are?
Oh, well, this is also one of those areas that's very sensitive for a lot of people that listen to and watch these interviews because um, the question that always comes up is, okay, what about victims of very serious offenses? So before I answer this question, one of the things that I'd like to share with you and your audience is that I'm a two-time survivor of violent crime. And one of the people who perpetrated an offense against me is serving a life without the possibility of parole sentence. So I am not coming from a cheap seat when I answer or say that extreme sentences, not only do they not serve the public good or make sense from an educational background, but in fact, they don't serve the purpose that we claim that they serve,
Yeah.
which is to offer a permanency of solution to the survivors of that offense. because what we know is the people who get sentenced to life without the possibility of parole are by and large Black. And we also know that Black communities are the largest survivors of violent crime, and that more often than not, they are what we call at the Sentencing Project dual victims, right? So we run into so many families in my work where they are a survivor of violent crime and they have a family member serving it. And it's a cycle of violence that we need to address. But we decided that life without the possibility of parole was the way to go. So, life without the possibility of parole is really problematic in a multitude of ways. Number one, people age out of crime. The criminological crime curve is well established and decades old at this juncture. People who are young, as anybody who has children or has been young themselves knows, do not have a fully developed brain until they are 25 to 27, depending on which doctor you ask. And that makes them much more impulsive, less able to calculate and take into account risk. It makes them more susceptible to peer pressure and pressure from their society to do whatever it is that they're being asked to do. So when you look at the graph of states when it comes to the age of people who've committed offenses that are serving life without the possibility of parole, more often than not, like I'll use Michigan, for example, over 60% of their offenses that are serving life without parole are people who were under the age of 26 at the time of their offense. This was also the basis for the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, which passed in Washington, D.C., IRA, also known as our Second Look Law, applied to people who were 25 and under because they have what we now legally accept as diminished culpability. Basically, they could not understand their offense in the same way that they would have if they were over that age. Then you get to people in their 30s and especially their 40s, drop off.
Yeah.
50s, committing a violent crime, almost unheard of. So when you incarcerate a 20-year-old, and they go 20, 30 years into their sentence, they're 50 now. Not only is that now massively expensive because you probably have spent close to $1 million incarcerating them for all of these years per year, because medical costs are skyrocketing across our carceral system. Um, Not only has the state wasted money, this person is no longer dangerous. They've also served a term that is the vast majority of their life. So, in terms of taking away from them based on what they've done, that has been more than accomplished. But actually, these people, when they come back into society, are actually some of our most productive citizens. There are violence interrupters. They are the credible messengers to the young people who are about to take the same route. And that's what we've done in Washington, D.C. I actually was an elected commissioner in the District of Columbia. I represented District 2FO8, and I was also the chair of public safety. And when we were seeing some crime rates increase in my area, I called the violence interruptions teams, and violence was down by 4% by the end of my tenure.
Oh,
This method works. Locking people up for forever is expensive. It actually doesn't make sense from a criminological standpoint, and it takes away the trust that certain communities that are most impacted want to have with the criminal legal system, but don't because of the disproportionality of who receives this sentence, and that
yeah.
hurts.
Yeah. I also like to say that what we're doing with those laws is we are sentencing the taxpayers to waste their money.
You know what?
Uh,
I have never used that line before, but I think I'm gonna steal that one from you, Glenn.
do that. Do that. I invite people to steal all my lines.
Yeah,
But
we're sentencing
really,
the
I mean,
taxpayers.
this is not a good use of our tax dollars, and you're actually sentencing us to waste our tax dollars for something that does not work and
I
makes it
actually
worse.
had the Vermont head of the Department of Corrections before a joint committee in Vermont beg the state legislature, saying that I am not a hospital. I am not set up to be one. I am not
Yeah,
set up to be a retirement home. You got to help me out here, or our prison population might go down, But because it's so elderly, I'm going to come back asking you for more money and more money year over year over year. Think of what we spend on the elderly in this country.
Yeah.
And now
Yeah.
you've put them in terrible conditions. Why?
Yeah. And we'll cover this a bit later in the interview, but it's a geriatric system that we're moving toward. It's bizarre.
It's
Um,
old.
yeah. So how do we change the laws? Do we educate the public? Do we lean on the legislators? How do we change these things?
Oh, well, this is my favorite topic.
Yeah, and we don't have a lot of time, so we'll keep it kind of
Okay, I'll keep this one shorter. So, the answer to your question is all of the above. At the end of the day, the state legislature works for you. The governor works for you, and by you, I mean the voter, the taxpayer. You have a great deal of say in who holds power. And the reason that they've continued to push these lines is because it's kept them in power. Because people don't understand what this is actually sentencing them, the taxpayer, to. So,
yeah,
what I encourage you to do is reach out to us at the Sentencing Project. One, if you'd like to get involved in the various bills that we're running in states all across the country. Two, call your representative and ask them what they're doing about the geriatric and large prison population in your state. And when legislation comes up, you and your friends need to get together and make it very clear to your legislator that they really kind of have two choices. They either represent you as you see fit, or you might have to get someone else to represent you.
yeah,
And when the public writ large, as we educate them, comes to a different conclusion, one of two things tends to happen, Glenn. We either have new representation or representation brought to heel to understand that this is not how we want to conduct either society or our fiscal notes.
yeah. I know that you have been urging states to cap maximum penalties at 20 years. And even
Yes.
20 is a long sentence, but capping it at 20 years would be a sensible reform. And that because of the kinds of things that you've been saying, also, this does not this is not soft on crime, and this does not leave society at risk, because as you say, the people as you age are much less likely to be committing violent crimes. And so the if we can catch people while they're young, and preferably do preventive things so they don't even commit the crimes, but cap the prison sentences, and then find sensible things.
I was part of a parole hearing of a man who had lost both of his legs. He was wheelchair bound, he was blind, and he had cancer. And the parole board didn't want to parole him. And I literally said, I think I said it on the news, I said, as a two-time survivor of violent crime, I can tell you I'm not afraid of a person who can't see me, is weak from cancer treatment, and cannot walk. Now,
Uh,
if that person is, as you would suggest, still dangerous, highly doubtful, but still dangerous, if they manage to catch me, I need to eat more fruit. And that's really on me.
yeah,
Not to be flippant about it, but we
yeah,
really do get, I mean, I give a ridiculous example because it is ridiculous.
yeah. Well, we need to counter that soft on crime kind of accusation. I've been working since the 1980s to abolish death penalty.
Oh, yeah.
A number of years ago, I've testified about that a number of times in state legislative committees. And several years ago, I was testifying to a state legislative committee here in Washington State, and one of the legislators asked, "Do you know anybody who's been murdered?" I said, "Yes, four of my friends have been murdered in separate crimes in different years, separate unrelated crimes." And I said, in none of those cases would the death penalty have been an appropriate remedy to solve the problem. And that took the legislator by surprise, because they figured that I'd say, "Oh no, I don't know anything about this. This is just I'm just an armchair liberal or
Well, I
something."
mean, my family's originally from Louisiana. The person who committed the offense against me ultimately received LWOP, but it was life without the possibility of parole. But it was actually a death penalty trial,
Uh-huh.
in which my family begged that this person not be put to death.
Yeah, there are organizations of victims' families who oppose the death penalty. One is called Murder
Many,
Victims Families for Reconciliation. Very
absolutely.
often at parole hearings and and clemency hearings, victims' family members will say, "Do not execute this guy."
Crime
It will not-
survivors for
it-
safety and justice
yeah,
are very adamant about it as well. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
There was
Now,
actually a study done on victims that over 60% of victims are not for excessive punishment.
uh,
They're for rehabilitation
yeah,
and responsibility taking.
yeah, we need things that'll solve the problem and not just keep the cycle of violence going. One of the smart remedies that you and other experts have been recommending is something that you had mentioned earlier in the interview here, the second look.
Yes.
It deals with sentences that are unjustly long or unfair in other ways. Can you tell us why we need a second look and how that would work in practice?
Well, you know what? I'll use a campaign example. So actually, you see the mug that I'm holding? It says Oklahoma Survivor Justice Coalition. This is the coalition in Oklahoma that is working on a bill, Senate Bill 1470, which would allow for resentencing under situations of domestic violence and trauma. Why is that important? Oklahoma is one of the largest incarcerators in the country and the world. It is also the largest incarcerator of women historically, still has the death penalty, but it also has the number one rate of domestic violence in the country, one of the top rates of women killed by men. And what they were doing was when the cops didn't show up to help a victim, they would punish that victim for shooting the person who was either trying to take their life or coerce them into an offense. And so we had all of these people serving life without the possibility of parole for scenarios that were utterly insane. Women who had 3 rape kits and 4 restraining orders against a guy, shot him after she got kidnapped, and is serving a life sentence. That's a true story about a woman named April Wilkins. So we said what we need is a law that allows us to go in and review sentences that do not make sense. And we call those second look laws. And they take a lot of different forms. But for example, in Oklahoma, we say that you can go back and review any cases where coercion, um, control, trauma, or interpersonal violence played part of the commission of your offense. And what you're going to find is that more often than not, in a state with those types of known interpersonal violence levels, that a lot of offenses are going to include it. And this allows us to bring justice after the fact, after what at least I would consider was poor decision making by the justice system on the front end. And that really is the concept of second look. It's not a get out of jail free card. It allows the system to take a look at your record now, how you've changed, and decide whether or not you can be safely released to society.
So one of the things that you've written about and advocated about is helping survivors of domestic abuse or victims of other violence um, protect themselves from being victimized by the criminal justice system. What remedies? The second look is one smart remedy. Are there other remedies that you would recommend?
Well, here's the interesting thing. It's gotten so bad that even people who are in like Oklahoma, for example, social workers, right? They run homes for women and people who are experiencing domestic violence to come to, have gotten on board with this campaign because they say so frequently the cops just show up and arrest these people.
Yeah,
So they got on board in a way that they normally never do because legislative action is not their job. They're social workers. They're the people who try to be on the front end. They're coming towards what we're doing on the back end with resentencing because they've seen so many of the people that they've attempted to help end up in our criminal justice system. And the reason for that is that we created a hammer and we decided everything was a nail,
yeah.
even right down to something like domestic violence that I think almost any American that you would poll would say that if somebody is trying to kill you, your children, or your loved one, and the cops are not helping you despite repeated asks for help, if it comes to your life or theirs, you should be able to defend yourself and not go to prison for life because of it. We have a case of a woman named Kibriana Boyd who was attacked at her home by a person who had been perpetrating domestic violence against her. And it's worth noting that after his death, because she saved her own life after he stabbed her in her pregnant stomach, she went to prison. And a review of his record showed that he had 12 other women who were survivors of his violence, and he had actually put one in a wheelchair.
Mhm.
But because she fought him off and ended up killing him after he stabbed her in her pregnant stomach, she's serving a life sentence. And that is crazy.
Yeah,
That is crazy. If you were just to ask any American, they would say that's crazy.
yeah,
But this is what Second Look allows us to do, to go in and say, that's not right. We need to take a second look at that.
yeah.
These laws help everyone, from the aging to DV survivors to people who have truly changed. So I always say Second Look gives us kind of three buckets: the people who've truly changed and reformed, who we should take a look at; the people who are elderly, sick, mentally ill, who shouldn't be there; and the cases where, quite frankly, we just got it wrong.
Yeah. Good. Um, I know one of the things that you folks work on at the Sentencing Project is uh, your work of advocating for state and local solutions. Some states are doing some smart things now to reduce unjust sentences, reduce prison populations, and so forth. Can you, and we're tight on time, can you summarize just a couple of examples of the kinds of things that some states are doing smartly?
Okay, well, we have over 100 different pieces of compassionate release, elder release legislation happening across the country. If you're sick and old and you're in a wheelchair and you can't see, you're probably not a threat to public safety. We can get you out of there.
Uh-huh.
The Sentencing Project is supporting second look laws in New York State, Vermont, Massachusetts, Oklahoma, Michigan, and a whole host of others. The state of Virginia actually just came very close, just passed some laws to help reduce incarceration with what's called good time credits. So for every day you don't have infractions and you show good behavior, you're able to reduce your sentence by a certain amount. This type of legislation is taking off across the country, from the reddest of the red to the bluest of the blue, for the same reason that you pointed out, Glenn. They've got elderly prison populations that they can't deal with, they're not designed to deal with, and they decided in the 1980s that life without the possibility of parole was a great idea, but they didn't stop to think about the long term.
Uh-huh.
And now they're being forced to pay the piper.
Yeah. Um, the Washington, D.C., you already mentioned with your experience there. Washington, D.C. is not a state, it's a city government that is controlled not only by its locally elected city officials, but also by Congress. And
It is a whole thing.
yeah, so recently, two bad things that happened. I wonder if you could just very, very briefly mention um, the U.S. House Oversight and Accountability Committee pushed forward something called the DC Crimes Act. Could you just briefly highlight what's wrong with that?
Ooh, does everybody remember George Floyd?
Yeah,
Remember watching a man getting suffocated on the news for 8
yeah.
minutes and 32 seconds? Well, we tried to pass laws to ensure that certain behaviors on behalf of our Metropolitan Police Department were no longer permitted. And this undoes that. It undoes a great deal of police accountability.
So
It,
it undoes the reforms that we've needed.
yes. Um, on top of that, it extends sentences, particularly for young people. Rather than treating young people who've gone astray as people who need our help and our guidance, and a better education system and more care from us, we've decided that if they steal a car, they should be eligible for a lengthy sentence as an adult.
Hmm, okay. And then the DC crime bill, secure DC crime bill, another bad idea. Briefly, what does that do?
So, this is the brainchild of Council Member Brooke Pinto, who represents one of the wealthiest areas of DC, an area where I am actually a resident. It's called Ward 2. It includes places like Logan Circle, DuPont Circle. If you were to not be Georgetown, if you were able to not be able to afford DC, this is where you would go. I only get to live here because my place is rent controlled. Um, she decided, based on what is a lot of fear, but not actual harm to her community, which is now predominantly white and predominantly wealthy, that we would enact more extreme sentencing laws almost across the board. She attempted to end our ability to offer second looks, but that was overturned by the public, and particularly the second look recipients that we already have. And she basically wants to allow the police to do things that we know are dangerous, pursue people in high-speed chases through Washington, D.C. We had a record number of crashes that were fatal to pedestrians because of this. So we overturned that law. She's trying to turn it back. We are very much tried to get away from treating young people as adults. She's attempting to bring that back. It's really a nightmare, in addition to which our police department has not always had a shining record when it comes to behavior towards the citizens they are sworn to protect.
So besides the things that we need to do at state levels, there's a lot of stuff that cities need to do about police behavior and so forth. And so it operates, there's federal, state, and local governments that need to
Yes.
do this. So,
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, anybody could have a mental health crisis at any point. They shouldn't be shot, suffocated, or put into chokeholds for it.
yeah,
That could happen to any of us.
yeah,
And nobody really takes these laws as seriously as they should until America has to watch a man suffocate to death for 8 minutes.
right,
And then we forget. And then it happens again. So when you feel that things are out of control, understand that these are not the solutions. There are other solutions, and they don't involve the police being able to act out brutality against the citizenry that they are sworn to protect.
yeah, yeah. Very often the police act like an occupying army in a city, and very often police departments hire people who have experience as military veterans, so they have been trained to occupy dark-skinned populations in other countries, and then they come back and they get hired as police
I
officers to
I
occupy
come
a
I
city.
come from a military family. I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. All 3 of my brothers are currently serving in different branches of the United States military. But even my brothers would say, as men of color, that there are rules of engagement that they are supposed to follow. Now, whether you like them or not is a separate conversation, but he said, but when it comes to whatever it is that you're doing, when you have the ability to have violent consequences, there have to be rules of engagement,
Yeah,
and they shouldn't include a whole host of things. And if we're talking about local police departments, there are a whole host of things that should not be included, because the day that it happens to your kid because they decide that they think that your kid is doing something, if you're a cop, you're supposed to have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that a specific crime is happening. That is an American's constitutional right to be away from unlawful search and seizure.
yeah,
Um, and this is not going well.
right. Well, and people in this country know that justice is not blind. The criminal justice system works differently depending on people's race, economic class, disability,
Gender,
mental disability. What was that?
gender.
Gender. Yes, yes. Yeah. So, I mean, we need to fix the systems in ways that pay attention to these various kinds of injustices that are embedded in the system as it exists now. And so we need to solve those, and things can be done at federal, state, and local levels. One thing that I like very well, I've been working, as I said, since the 1980s to abolish death penalty, and I was tremendously happy when in 2009, North Carolina passed the Racial Justice Act, and that law allowed defendants to change their death sentences to regular sentences of life in prison if they could show that racial discrimination had been a factor in their prosecution. And we know from extensive research that racial justice affects how the police do their investigation, how juries are chosen, and on and on and on.
We should
And
also understand that that legal mechanism, which is strict scrutiny, to show that you are being discriminated against, either based on race, gender, or anything that we consider federally protected, is a very, very high standard. And a
yeah,
lot of times, police departments are not truthful about what happened in the event.
yeah,
So even in those instances, while it's a great step forward, we have a lot more to do because that's a tough one to prove
yeah,
sometimes.
yeah. And I know that in North Carolina, some defendants did successfully use the Racial Justice Act that had been
Yes.
passed in 2009. But in 2013, North Carolina's state government repealed the law. And
Yes.
I wish other states would do that as well. In Washington State, where I live, meticulous research proved that Washington State's use of the death penalty has been thoroughly perverted by racial biases throughout all of our state's history. And in 2018, the state Supreme Court here in Washington unanimously ruled that the death penalty here is unconstitutional because it's so arbitrary, cruel, and racist. So we need more of that kind of scrutiny.
And also, I mean, like during the crack epidemic, that is also when Washington State decided to do away with parole.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I have firsthand experience dealing with the research leading up to the legislation that dealt with the determinate sentencing law that the legislature passed. It was House Bill 440 in about 1981. And we don't have time to get into that.
Yeah. Another time, Glenn, another
Yeah,
time.
another time. Yeah. People assume that there's a straight line between public safety and fairness, and then they assume it's a zero-sum game where, in order to get more public safety, we have to sacrifice fairness, or in order to get fairness, we have to sacrifice public safety. But actually, it's possible to maximize both. And I have long supported restorative justice that
Yes.
that does both public safety and fairness, and it actually cares for victims. And we're tight on time. I did a TV program on restorative justice quite a number of years ago, but could you summarize for the viewers now the basic pitch of what it does? It's a bold, compassionate, practical alternative to the status quo that protects the public while providing an authentic kind of justice. Can you tell us how that can work briefly?
I've actually been able to witness this where survivors get to talk with the person who perpetrated the offense against them or somebody who was part of the offense. And what you see is a lot of pain leaving the scenario. How do we know that we fail victims? It's because they're not healed 10, 20, 30, 40 years later. We give an extreme sentence and we leave them without access to mental health. We don't allow people who've perpetrated offenses even the opportunity to apologize and take responsibility for their offenses. And restorative justice allows us an opportunity to do all of these things, to care for both sides of the scenario, to bring healing and responsibility to what is a often awful situation. And watching two people who have suffered incarceration and victimization heal and decide outside of a brutal system what they individually want for themselves and from each other is so much more is so much better and more holistic, and it really is the closest thing to a miracle that I think I have ever witnessed. So if you're into miracles and good things, you should be into restorative justice.
And this has been part of some traditional cultures in Native American communities, in different parts of Africa, and some other places, where at the village level, somebody does something bad, and instead of just expelling the person, they say, "Okay, let's bring the village together here and have some healing. Find out what happened. Find out how it affected the victim. Have the victim speak on their own behalf." And see what we can do to restore the wholeness of the village.
Offenses impact whole communities.
Yeah, yeah, So
for the person who's taken into prison and for the people that were part of the offense.
yeah, so this provides healing for the community and not just a let's just throw the bad guy in prison and throw away the key. One of the organizations working on this, or several, is Equal Justice USA. The website is www.ejusa.org. um, we've talked about a number of problems. We've talked about some solutions, um, and we need what we need is advocacy, as you and I both know. We both put a lot of efforts and skills and strategies into how to advocate, get the changes that we need at whatever level of government, and educating the public so the public will move on our side. If the politicians think that they're doing what the public wants, but they're really being stupid, we need to get the public to say, no, we don't want what you're giving us. We want this smarter solution instead. Then the public can lean on the politicians and then they will bend our way. And I
Precisely.
workshops about how to do that.
Yeah, if you don't like what they're doing, it's either you can tell them to do something else, and if they don't do something else, you can get someone else.
Yeah, yep. Um, Governments are usually too slow to solve problems, and the leadership and political pressure has to come from the bottom up. And
Absolutely.
ordinary people and a lot of really great nonprofit organizations are doing things to push not only for the issues that we're talking about here, but all the other issues we care about on economic justice and environment and everything else. And I offer free online workshops to help people develop their skills and strategies to do that. And people can contact me to look for next opportunities. And
Love
I'll
that.
at the end of the thing, I'll put my phone number and email, but I'm at 360-491-9093. And the email is Glen, Glen, at parallaxperspectives.org, Parallax perspectives.org. Long before people go to prison, they suffer various kinds of unfairness and injustices from problems in policing. We've talked about that a bit. Is there anything else you want to say about that? And then I want to put in a good pitch for the sentencing project. We're running tight on time, but I want to make sure that we
No,
tell people
I
how
will
good the
say
sentencing project is.
I will say that there's a lot to learn about these subjects, so please visit us at
Yes.
sentencingproject.org. You're able to find me on our website. If you'd like to join our movement in any of the states that we're currently working in, you'll be able to see them and sign up for actions and the ability to contact your legislature. But understand that if incarceration made America safe, we would be the safest nation on earth, and we're not.
Yeah,
Um, and actually, when it comes to public safety, we usually rank in the bottom 50%
yeah,
global. So we need to do new things. We would love for the people who watch and listen to this to be part of that.
right. Yeah, I invited Alexandra to be the guest here because she works for the sentencing project. And for a great number of years, I've been working for reforming our prison system. And I've been reading information that they produce, and I've been sending them as much money as I possibly can.
Thank
And
you.
so for more than 30 years, the Sentencing Project has been researching, reporting, and advocating for fairness in the criminal justice system. And their experts tackle a number of systemic problems, including racial disparities and other systemic problems. And they work, as she says, at the national, state, and local levels. And I encourage people to visit their website, sentencingproject.org, learn more about what they do, and consider donating financial support, as I've been doing for a number of years. And let's see, I think we're on to the next page. There's a lot of information available. I've been studying this stuff since the 60s. And when I post our video to the blog, my blog, parallaxperspectives.org, I also will post a thorough summary of what we have been saying during this interview. It won't be quite a transcript, but it'll be pretty close to that. And along with the things that we said, I'll show the two graphs I showed earlier in the thing. I'll also provide lists and links to more information. So visit my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org, Parallax perspectives.org. And so you can click to watch the video or click to read the transcript or the thorough summary. And then the thorough summary will have lots of links to more information. And 2 years ago, my August 2022 TV program focused on felony sentences, and I interviewed Nazgul Ganoush, who has amazing research and provided really smart insights. And we didn't overlap that because Alexandra has different areas of expertise and the advocacy end of things. So,
Like I said to Glenn before we started this, I'm not the brains at the sentencing project, I'm the muscle.
so that's good. We need that. And so that's on my blog, and I'll have the link to that. Also, I recommend the American Civil Liberties Union, Death Penalty Information Center, Innocence Project, Equal Justice Initiative, Equal Justice USA, and there'll be links to all those websites. Also on my blog, there's a whole category for criminal justice, and so you can check the criminal justice link to my blog, as well as the TV programs link, where this program will be at both of those places, criminal justice and the TV programs. I want to thank Alexandra Bailey for sharing her information and insights during this interview. I want to thank the people who've been watching the program. And I often hear people say that you can see how a society is civilized, the extent to which a society is civilized, by seeing how they treat the people at the bottom rungs of that society. And folks who commit crimes are stuck onto society's bottom rungs. And so to improve our society and make it more fair, we need to understand that process that puts people on the bottom rungs and how to reform the processes so those rungs are not so far down and people can rejoin mainstream society. And then we can all live together in a truly fair society. So let's apply wisdom, information, and compassion so that we can solve the systemic problems in our criminal justice system, as well as other aspects of our system, economics and everything else. So invite your friends everywhere to watch this program through my blog, because it's available anywhere, and also to click the link on my blog for the thorough summary has information. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. You can phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it, and the world needs whatever you can offer. So thanks to all of you, and thanks again, Alexandra.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Glenn. I had a great time.
Yeah, well, we always have a good time, as well as informing people. It's fun to learn,
Absolutely.
and it's fun to take positive actions.
I'll see you soon.
Good, thank you, thank you.